There's a structure on the coast of France that shouldn't exist. Not anymore. During World War II, the Allied air forces threw everything they had at it. Over 1,000 bomber missions, tens of thousands of tons of explosives, entire squadrons of B-17s and Lancasters hammering away month after month, year after year. They destroyed the city around it. They turned the surrounding neighborhoods into rubble. But the fortress itself? It barely got a scratch. Today, 79 years after the war ended, it's still standing, massive, defiant, a monument to engineering so extreme, so over the top in its construction that it bordered on insanity. The Germans built it to protect their most valuable weapons, the U-boats, the submarines that came closer than anything else to winning the war for Hitler. And the Allies knew that if they couldn't destroy these fortresses, if they couldn't stop the U-boats from launching, Britain would starve. America's supply lines would be cut. The war would be lost. This is the story of the St. Nazaire U-boat base, a fortress that consumed more concrete than the entire Maginot Line, a structure so impenetrable that even direct hits from 2-ton bombs did nothing more than chip the paint. And it's the story of the 1,000 bomber raids that tried, desperately, frantically, to bring it down. Because in the end, destroying this fortress wasn't about explosives or tactics or technology. It was about will. And the question that haunted Allied commanders for years: how do you destroy something that simply refuses to die? To understand why this fortress mattered so much, you have to understand the U-boat war, the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, lasting from September 1939 to May 1945. Nearly 6 years of submarines hunting convoys, of merchant ships sinking, of sailors drowning in freezing water thousands of miles from home. And for most of that time, Germany was winning. The U-boats were Hitler's secret weapon. Not secret in the sense that no one knew about them, but secret in their effectiveness. A single submarine, crewed by 50 men, could sink dozens of ships carrying thousands of tons of supplies. Food for Britain, oil for the RAF, tanks and trucks and ammunition for the armies. Everything Britain needed to survive came by ship across the Atlantic, and the U-boats were cutting those lifelines, one convoy at a time. By 1942, the situation was desperate. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. In that year alone, over 1,600 Allied vessels went to the bottom. That's more than 4 ships every single day. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, because if the submarines won, everything else was irrelevant. No supplies meant no army. No army meant no invasion. No invasion meant Hitler controlled Europe forever. And where did these U-boats come from? Where did they refuel, rearm, and repair between patrols? From bases on the French Atlantic coast: Brest, Lorient, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, and the biggest of them all, St. Nazaire. St. Nazaire sits at the mouth of the Loire River, right where it empties into the Atlantic. Before the war, it was a bustling port city, famous for shipbuilding. Massive ocean liners were constructed there. The city had deep water access, huge dry docks, and all the infrastructure you'd need to maintain a fleet. When France fell in June 1940 and the Germans occupied the Atlantic coast, Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, looked at St. Nazaire and saw opportunity. This would be his fortress, his unsinkable base, the place where his wolf packs would rest between hunts. But there was a problem. U-boats are vulnerable when they're in port. They're sitting ducks. One good bombing raid could destroy an entire flotilla while they're tied up at the docks. Donitz needed protection. Not just any protection. Absolute, total, impossible to penetrate protection. So the Germans did something unprecedented. They decided to build submarine pens that could withstand anything the Allies could drop on them. And I mean anything. Direct hits from the heaviest bombs in existence, multiple hits,
sustained bombardment. These pins would be covered by concrete roofs so thick, so massively over-engineered, that they would laugh at British bombers.
Construction began in February 1941. The French port of Saint-Nazaire was transformed into a construction site of almost unimaginable scale. The Germans conscripted thousands of French workers, brought in German engineers, and poured resources into the project that could have built entire cities. This wasn't just a military base. This was a statement. This was Germany showing the world what German engineering could accomplish. The design was brutally simple and brutally effective. 14 separate U-boat pens arranged in a massive rectangular structure. Each pen was basically a covered dock, a channel where a submarine could pull in from the harbor, protected on all sides by reinforced concrete. The walls were thick, sure, but the real genius was the roof. The roof. That's what made it invincible. 3 separate layers of reinforced concrete, each one several feet thick, with air gaps between them. The theory was simple. When a bomb hits the first layer, it explodes. The blast dissipates in the air gap. If anything makes it through, there's a second layer to stop it. And if somehow, impossibly, something penetrates the second layer, there's a third. It was redundancy taken to an extreme that bordered on paranoia. The total thickness of the roof. In some places, over 24 feet of reinforced concrete. 24 feet. That's as tall as a 2-story house. Imagine dropping a bomb on a building made entirely of concrete 2 stories thick. That's what Allied bombers were facing. The construction consumed 480,000 cubic meters of concrete. To put that in perspective, that's enough concrete to build a solid wall 8 feet high and 3 feet thick from New York to Philadelphia, for a single building. The steel reinforcement bars inside that concrete weighed 30,000 tons. The entire structure covered an area of 37,000 square meters. It was one of the largest construction projects in occupied Europe. And it worked. By early 1942, the first pens were operational. U-boats could now enter Saint-Nazaire, pull into their protected berths, undergo maintenance and repairs, reload torpedoes, and head back out into the Atlantic, all while being completely safe from air attack. The base could handle up to 20 submarines simultaneously. It had workshops, storage facilities, crew quarters, command centers, everything the U-boat fleet needed. The British knew this was happening. Reconnaissance photos showed the construction progress. They could see the massive concrete structure taking shape, and they knew what it meant. If the Germans completed this base, if they had an unsinkable fortress from which to launch their submarines, the Battle of the Atlantic would become even more desperate. So they decided to bomb it, to destroy it before it became fully operational, to show the Germans that nothing, no matter how well built, could stand against Allied air power. They had no idea what they were up against. The first major raid came in November 1942. 31 RAF Lancasters attacked Saint-Nazaire in a nighttime bombing run. They dropped dozens of bombs, aiming for the submarine pens, trying to collapse the roof, to punch through the concrete. The bombs fell, the explosions lit up the night, and when the smoke cleared and reconnaissance photos came back, the damage assessment was shocking. Nothing. The submarine pens were completely undamaged, not a crack in the roof, not a dent in the walls. The bombs had hit, sure. Several of them had scored direct hits on the structure, but they'd simply exploded on the surface, doing nothing more than scorching the concrete. It was like throwing rocks at a mountain. The Allied commanders couldn't believe it. Bombs that could demolish city blocks, that could crater runways and collapse buildings, were bouncing off this structure like raindrops. They sent more raids, bigger raids. In January 1943, 82 RAF bombers hit Saint-Nazaire. Still nothing. In February, another massive raid. March, April, month after month the bombers came, and month after month the submarine pens stood firm. The frustration was palpable. Bomber Command was throwing everything they had at this target. They tried different tactics: high-altitude precision bombing, low-altitude skip bombing, different types of bombs, armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate before exploding, delayed fuse bombs that would theoretically dig into the concrete before detonating. Nothing worked. The problem was physics. To penetrate that much concrete, you needed incredible kinetic energy.
The bomb had to hit with enough force to punch through before it exploded. But bombs dropped from high altitude reached terminal velocity pretty quickly. They could only fall so fast. And that speed, combined with the weight of even the heaviest bombs available in 1942 and 1943, just wasn't enough. The concrete was too thick. The construction was too solid.
So, the bombs exploded on the surface. And reinforced concrete, when it's built properly, can absorb enormous amounts of blast energy. The steel rebar inside the concrete flexes, but doesn't break. The concrete itself cracks, but doesn't shatter. And with 3 separate layers and air gaps between them, the structure was designed specifically to withstand this kind of attack. The Germans, meanwhile, were delighted. Goebbels' propaganda machine made sure the world knew that Allied bombing was ineffective against German engineering. Newsreels showed U-boat crews going about their business, servicing their submarines inside the pens, completely unbothered by the bombing raids happening overhead. The message was clear. German fortifications are impregnable. Allied air power is useless. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong. By mid-1943, the bombing campaign had reached absurd proportions. The Allies had flown over 600 sorties against Saint-Nazaire. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs. And the submarine pens remained operational, 100% operational. Not a single U-boat had been damaged inside the pens, not one. And the submarine pens? Still standing, still operational, still launching U-boats into the Atlantic. The moral calculus was brutal. Allied commanders knew they were killing French civilians. They knew that every raid that missed the pens hit someone's home, someone's family. But they also knew that if they didn't keep trying, if they didn't keep the pressure on, more Allied sailors would die in the Atlantic, more supply ships would sink, more soldiers would go without ammunition and food. The war might be lost. It's one of those impossible decisions that war forces on people. There's no good choice. There's only less bad choices. And the less bad choice was to keep bombing, even knowing the human cost. In 1943, the Americans joined the campaign with their B-17 flying fortresses. The 8th Air Force brought a different approach. Where the RAF specialized in nighttime area bombing, the Americans believed in daylight precision bombing. They had the Norden bomb sight, a top-secret device that theoretically allowed pinpoint accuracy from high altitude. They were convinced they could do what the RAF couldn't, hit the submarine pens precisely, put bombs exactly where they needed to go, and crack that concrete roof. They were wrong. The B-17s came in waves, formations of dozens of bombers, flying at 25,000 feet, dropping their loads in coordinated attacks designed to saturate the target. The bombs fell, the explosions were massive, and the submarine pens remained undamaged. The Norden bomb sight, for all its technological sophistication, couldn't change physics. The bombs still weren't heavy enough. The concrete was still too thick. But the Americans kept trying. They had to. The U-boat threat was still critical. By 1943, the tide was beginning to turn in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies had developed better convoy tactics, better sonar, better depth charges. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading German naval communications. More U-boats were being sunk, but they were still launching from bases like Saint-Nazaire, and as long as those bases were operational, the threat remained. So the bombing continued. In some months, Saint-Nazaire was hit almost daily. The air raid sirens became a constant background noise. The people of the city lived in basements and shelters, emerging only when they had to, knowing that at any moment another raid could come. The Germans, meanwhile, kept working. They actually expanded the submarine pens during the war, adding more berths, thickening the roof in places, making an already impenetrable structure even more impenetrable. It became a point of pride for the Luftwaffe, ironically. German fighter pilots would scramble to intercept the Allied bombers, knowing they were defending a structure that didn't really need defending. The submarine pens could take care of themselves. But the fighter opposition added another layer of difficulty for the Allied bombers. Now they weren't just dropping bombs on an invincible target. They were doing it while being shot at by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The bomber crews hated the Saint-Nazaire missions. It was a known fact that you were flying into heavy flak, that you'd face fighter opposition, and that your bombs probably wouldn't do anything even if they hit the target. It felt pointless, suicidal, and yet they kept flying the missions because orders were orders, and someone
somewhere, thought it might make a difference. The Allies tried everything. In 1944, they developed the Tallboy bomb, a massive 12,000-pound earthquake bomb designed by Barnes Wallis, the same engineer who created the bouncing bomb used in the Dam Busters raid. The Tallboy was different from conventional bombs. It was designed to penetrate deep into the ground or into structures before exploding, creating a shockwave that would destroy from within rather than from above.
A few Tallboys were dropped on St. Nazaire. They were the most powerful conventional bombs in the Allied arsenal at that point. Each one was a 6-ton monster, streamlined for maximum penetration, dropped from extreme altitude to build up maximum velocity. They hit the submarine pens, they punched into the concrete roof, and they detonated. And for the first time, there was actual damage. Not catastrophic damage, not the roof collapsed and the pens are unusable damage, but actual visible damage. Cracks appeared in the concrete, chunks were blown off. In a few places, the Tallboys penetrated through the first layer of the roof, though none made it through all 3 layers. It was progress, marginal, frustrating progress, but progress nonetheless. But by 1944, the strategic situation had changed. The D-Day invasion had happened. Allied forces were advancing through France. The U-boat threat, while still real, was no longer critical. The war was being won on land now. And there were more important targets to bomb than a submarine base that, while still operational, was no longer the existential threat it had been in 1942.
So the bombing of St. Nazaire tapered off, not because they destroyed it, but because it didn't matter as much anymore. The Allies were going to win the war regardless of whether the submarine pens stood or fell. And as Allied troops advanced across France in late 1944, the Germans in St. Nazaire found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply lines, besieged on land rather than from the air. The siege of St. Nazaire lasted from August 1944 until May 1945. Allied forces surrounded the city but didn't assault it directly. Why would they? The city was already destroyed from bombing. The submarine pens, ironically, became shelters for German troops and French civilians alike. Those impenetrable concrete roofs that had withstood years of Allied bombs now protected everyone inside, regardless of nationality, from the occasional artillery barrage. The German garrison held out until May 11, 1945, 3 days after VE Day. They were literally the last German forces in France to surrender. And when they finally did march out, when Allied troops entered St. Nazaire and inspected the submarine pens up close, they were stunned.
The structure was magnificent. Even after years of bombing, after thousands of tons of explosives had been dropped on it, the submarine pens were still fundamentally intact. The roof was scarred, pockmarked with craters, missing chunks here and there, but it hadn't collapsed. The pens themselves were still usable. If Germany had wanted to keep launching U-boats from St. Nazaire after the surrender, they probably could have. The engineers who inspected the site filed reports that were almost admiring in tone. The Germans had built something extraordinary. The over-engineering, which had seemed like overkill, had proven to be exactly what was needed. The redundancy in the design, the multiple layers of concrete, the air gaps, the sheer thickness of the construction, it had all worked exactly as intended. In total, the Allies flew over 1,000 bomber sorties against St. Nazaire submarine pens. They dropped approximately 40,000 tons of bombs on the city and the base. That's roughly 80 million pounds of explosives. They lost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. They killed thousands of French civilians. And the submarine pens remained operational from 1942 until the German surrender in 1945. It was one of the most one-sided defeats in the history of aerial warfare. Not a defeat in the traditional sense because the Allies won the war, but a defeat in this specific mission, to destroy the submarine pens. They tried for 3 years and failed completely. After the war, the question became, what do you do with a structure like this? You can't easily demolish it. The same characteristics that made it immune to bombing make it incredibly difficult to tear down. Explosives that would level a normal building barely scratch it. You'd need to spend enormous amounts of money and time to dismantle it piece by piece. So the French didn't. They just left it. The submarine pens at St. Nazaire still stand today. They're used for various purposes now.
Some areas have been converted into warehouses and industrial spaces. Parts of the structure house a museum about the war and the U-boat campaign. Artists have used some sections for exhibitions and installations. The massive concrete spaces have an eerie cathedral-like quality to them.
You can visit if you want. You can walk through the pens where U-boats once docked. You can look up at the ceiling and see the scars from Allied bombs. You can run your hand along concrete that's nearly 80 years old and feel the history embedded in it. And you can marvel at the sheer audacity of the construction, the absolute commitment to building something that would not, could not fall. The structure has become a tourist attraction, which is darkly ironic. During the war, it was a target that cost thousands of lives in the attempt to destroy it. Now it's a historical site where people take selfies. The French have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, it's a reminder of occupation, of collaboration, of the years when France was under German control. On the other hand, it's an undeniable piece of history, and there's something to be said for preserving even the uncomfortable parts of our past. Other cities on the French coast have similar structures. Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, they all had submarine pens, and they all still stand. Some have been more integrated into modern use than others. Lorient's pens are used for sailing clubs and marine industries. Brest's are a mix of military and civilian use. La Rochelle's house cultural venues and businesses. These indestructible relics of Nazi engineering are now just part of the landscape, repurposed, redefined, but never forgotten.
There's a broader lesson in the story of St. Nazaire's submarine pens. It's about the limits of air power. In the 1930s and early 1940s, there was this belief, almost a faith, that strategic bombing could win wars on its own, that you could destroy an enemy's industrial capacity, their ability to fight from the air, that heavy bombers were the ultimate weapon. The submarine pens proved that wrong. They showed that with enough resources, with enough engineering, you could build structures that were effectively immune to conventional bombing. The Allies learned this lesson the hard way. They learned that air power, for all its value, had limitations, that some targets couldn't be destroyed from the air, no matter how many bombs you dropped. This influenced post-war military thinking. It's part of why nuclear weapons became so central to Cold War strategy, because conventional bombs couldn't destroy hardened targets like the submarine pens, but nuclear weapons could. The development of bunker-buster bombs, of deep penetration munitions, of precision-guided weapons, all of that came partly from the frustration of campaigns like St. Nazaire.
But there's another lesson too, one about the human cost of strategic decisions. The bombing of St. Nazaire killed thousands of French civilians and accomplished nothing militarily. The submarine pens remained operational. The city was destroyed for no strategic gain. And yet, Allied commanders kept ordering the raids because they felt they had to be seen doing something, trying something, even when it was clear it wasn't working. That's the tragedy of it. Not just the deaths, but the fact that those deaths were meaningless. The bombers could have been used elsewhere, against targets they could actually destroy. The resources could have been allocated differently. But once a campaign starts, once commanders commit to a course of action, it's incredibly difficult to stop, to admit that it's not working, to change strategy. In the decades since the war, military historians have debated whether the bombing campaign against St. Nazaire was worth it. Some argue that even though the pens weren't destroyed, the constant threat of bombing disrupted operations, made it harder for the Germans to work efficiently, forced them to allocate resources to defense that could have been used elsewhere, that it was psychological warfare as much as physical warfare.
Others argue that it was a complete waste, that the Allies should have recognized early on that the pens were unbombable and focused their efforts on other aspects of the U-boat war, like bombing the factories where the submarines were built, or the rail lines that transported them to the coast, like targeting the U-boats themselves when they were at sea, rather than trying to destroy their bases. Both arguments have merit. War is messy. Strategy is complicated. What seems obvious in hindsight wasn't always clear at the time. The commanders making these decisions were working with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, trying to balance competing priorities and limited resources. But standing in those submarine pens today, looking at the massive concrete roof with its bomb scars,
It's hard not to think about the futility of it. All those missions, all those aircraft, all those crew members who died, all those French families who lost their homes. And for what? The structure still stands. The Germans used it until the day they surrendered. The Allies never succeeded in their objective.
It's a monument, yes, but it's also a warning, a reminder that engineering, when done right, when resources are unlimited and skill is applied, can create things that are incredibly difficult to destroy. And a reminder that military force, no matter how overwhelming, has its limits. The U-boat pins at St. Nazaire represent something unique in military history. They're proof that the defender's advantage, given enough concrete and steel, can be nearly absolute. They're evidence that World War II, despite being a war of movement and mechanization, still had room for fortress warfare, for defensive structures so strong they were effectively invincible. But they're also proof that invincibility doesn't mean victory. The U-boat pins never fell, but Germany lost the war. The U-boats kept launching, but the Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies. The fortress stood, but it didn't matter, because ultimately the war wasn't decided by who had the strongest concrete or the most impenetrable defenses. It was decided by who had the resources, the manpower, the will to keep fighting until the other side couldn't continue. The Germans built something incredible at St. Nazaire. They created a structure that defied 3 years of sustained aerial bombardment. They proved that their engineering was as good as they claimed. But in the end, that wasn't enough. The Allies couldn't destroy the submarine pins, but they destroyed everything else. They sank the U-boats at sea. They liberated France on land. They won the war despite failing to take down this one fortress. And now, decades later, the fortress remains, not as a symbol of German victory, but as a memorial to the entire campaign, to the U-boat crews who launched from there and never came back, to the Allied sailors who died in the Atlantic, to the bomber crews who flew mission after mission against an indestructible target, to the French civilians who were caught in the middle, to everyone whose life was touched by this fortress and the war that raged around it. The fortress still stands, and it probably always will, not because anyone wants it to, but because destroying it would take more effort than it's worth. So it sits there on the coast of France, this massive concrete relic, this monument to over-engineering and military futility, a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much firepower you bring to bear, some things just won't break.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe we need reminders like this. Reminders that the world is more complicated than we think. That victory isn't always clean or complete. That some battles can't be won the way we want to win them. The 1,000 bombers that attacked St. Nazaire didn't destroy the fortress. But they didn't have to. Because in the end, the fortress wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the will to keep fighting, the determination to win the war even when individual battles were lost, the understanding that some defeats are acceptable if they're part of a larger victory. The submarine pins at St. Nazaire stand today as a testament to that truth. They survived the war. They survived everything the Allies threw at them. But they stand in a world where the ideology that built them was defeated. They're a fortress without an army, a base without a purpose, a monument to a war that was lost despite their survival. And in that way, maybe the Allies did destroy them after all. Not physically, but in every other way that matters. That's the real story of the fortress that took 1,000 bombers to destroy. It's not about the concrete or the bombs. It's about what we're willing to sacrifice, what we're willing to endure, and what we're willing to accept as victory. Because sometimes, destroying something isn't about making it fall. Sometimes it's about making it irrelevant. And that's exactly what happened here. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Leave a comment with other incredible engineering feats from World War II you'd like us to cover. And if you want to support the work we do, check the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.